Ever pulled up to a public EV charger with a blinking red battery icon, only to find the machine simply refuses to work? Yeah, it is incredibly frustrating. Today, we are taking a deep dive into a massive gap in our modern transportation network. On one side, you have the grand expectation, billions in federal funding promises, and a seamless transition to clean energy. But on the other side, you have the ground-level reality, which is often a lot messier. We're going to break down exactly why these failures are happening, look at the turbulent political realities shaping the funding, and explore an ingenious, data-driven solution from researchers at Stanford that might just fix the whole thing.
To really grasp the scale of this problem, we need to look at the daily driver experience. Between 2021 and 2024, the consumer intelligence firm J.D. Power tracked how EV drivers were actually faring out in the wild, and their findings were honestly pretty eye-opening. They discovered that roughly 19 to 24% of drivers pulled up to a public charging station and were completely unable to charge their car. Think about that for a second. That is basically 1 in 5 charging attempts ending in total failure. For a technology that's supposed to rival the rock-solid reliability of the classic gas station, a 20% failure rate is a massive roadblock for consumer confidence.
What is genuinely fascinating, though, is exactly how these chargers are failing. You might assume people are just dealing with smashed screens or physically severed cables, right? Well, a 2022 study in the San Francisco Bay Area looked at non-functional chargers, and they found that actual physical broken connectors made up a surprisingly tiny fraction of the problem. The real culprits are almost entirely invisible. We're talking payment system failures, charge initiation failures, and weird on-screen error messages. It brilliantly illustrates that we aren't just fighting a heavy-duty hardware maintenance battle here. We are dealing with complex software and networking issues.
Let's move into part 1, the billion-dollar promise.
Take a look at this massive number, $885 million. That is the federal apportionment for fiscal year 2026 under the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, formula program. It's part of a massive initiative designed to hand federal dollars over to states and localities so they can strategically build out charging infrastructure. The ultimate goal was to create a highly interconnected, reliable network of chargers along major alternative fuel corridors. But here is the stark reality check. Even though a staggering $4.4 billion has been made available under the NEVI program so far, states have actually only managed to spend about 2% of it. That is roughly $94 million successfully deployed out of billions sitting on the table. It definitely isn't moving at the speed of light. The rollout has been incredibly slow, largely because it's bogged down by procurement delays and the massive logistical headaches of getting heavy hardware into the ground and turned on. Which brings us to part 2, an uncertain funding future. The timeline here outlines some pretty turbulent federal funding realities. Back in 2021, the NEV program was established by the Biden administration through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Fast forward to early 2025, and the incoming Trump administration placed a freeze on that funding. While the freeze was ultimately lifted later that year, the program soon hit another roadblock. The U.S. House passed a resolution slashing $500 million from NEV, which President Trump then signed into law as part of the 2026 budget. So what does this all mean for the future of the network? Well, the build-out is now highly constrained. Roughly $1.4 billion in funds that states had previously obligated for charger installations is now thrown entirely into doubt. With only $300 million explicitly authorized for 2026, states are suddenly competing for a much, much smaller pool of money. Because we can no longer count on an endless stream of federal dollars to just build new chargers, it is now absolutely critical that the ones we already have on the ground actually work. Let's explore why that's so difficult in part 3, the uptime illusion. The root of the maintenance problem becomes glaringly obvious when you look at how these stations are wired. Almost 90% of the public charging sites in the U.S. are connected to third-party network providers. Think of companies like ChargePoint or Blink. Because the physical chargers communicate directly with a central third-party management system, the people who actually own the property where the charger is located are completely locked out of their own real-time performance data. This dynamic introduces the unsung hero of our story, the charging site operator, or CSO. These are the universities, the municipalities, the grocery stores, and the hotels that actually host these stations in their parking lots. They are the ones fielding the angry complaints from drivers when a charger fails. Yet because the performance data bypasses them and goes straight to the third-party network, these site operators are essentially flying blind. They just don't have the granular diagnostic data needed to fix the broken machines on their own property. Because they lack direct access to this data, operators are forced to rely on broad, government-mandated metrics to gauge performance.
Right now, the gold standard is something called NEVI uptime, which basically just checks to see if a charger was online over the course of a year. But industry experts heavily criticize the standard. They call it relatively simplistic and note that it's necessary but not sufficient. Why? Because simply knowing a station was online for most of the year doesn't tell you a thing about why it failed when it went offline.
This reliance on basic annual reporting creates a massive blind spot. It leads directly to what researchers at Stanford have dubbed zombie chargers. These are chargers that experience high-frequency, intermittent network drops throughout the day, completely ruining the experience for drivers. But because the network eventually reconnects, all that brief downtime just gets absorbed into a yearly average. The charger passes its annual evaluation, and the site operator has no idea the machine is fundamentally broken. Which brings us to our final section, actionable charging metrics. So, how do we actually empower these operators? Researchers at Stanford University proposed a whole new suite of actionable performance metrics using an open-source tool called EVC. Unlike the flawed NEVI uptime metric, which masks the root causes behind annual averages, these actionable metrics decompose the charger's behavior into operationally meaningful states. They're highly diagnostic, you can evaluate them over specific periods like weeks or days instead of years, and most importantly, they identify exactly why a fault is happening. To give control back to site operators, the researchers broke the data down into 4 specific metrics. You have your standard uptime, sure, but then you add fault time, which isolates the exact moments the machine self-reports an internal hardware malfunction. Then you have fault reason time, which categorizes the exact error code. And finally, the game changer, unreachable time. This captures periods when the charger loses its communication with the management system, which is exactly what prevents user authentication and stops your payment from going through. To prove this framework actually works in the real world, the researchers ran a massive 7-year case study at a California university hosting 98 chargers. At the start of the study, the hardware was already an average of 7.5 years old. From 2018 to 2019, things were fantastic. The site boasted over 98% uptime. But starting around 2020, the performance began to degrade drastically, leaving the operators incredibly frustrated because they couldn't figure out what was physically breaking. And this is exactly why granular data is absolutely crucial. When the team ran the historical data through their new metrics tool, they found that by 2023, uptime had collapsed to under 76%. But the real breakthrough was seeing what drove that downtime. Fault time sat at 13.5%, but unreachable time accounted for a massive 10.6%. This proved that a huge chunk of the failures had absolutely nothing to do with broken cables or fried circuits. It was local network drops. Armed with this highly specific data, operators no longer have to rely on vague driver complaints. They can demand targeted network fixes from their providers. So, what is the ultimate takeaway for us today? The reality is that the era of relying on massive, unchecked federal grants to just build our way out of this problem is pausing. With billions frozen and future budgets slashed, the industry's priority has to shift toward efficiency. Empowering local site operators with open-source diagnostic tools like the ones developed at Stanford is really our best hope to revive the zombie chargers plaguing the network today. Which leaves us with one final pressing thought as this technology scales. Will our charging infrastructure data catch up to driver demand, or are we simply driving toward a dead battery?